welcome back to the Deep Dive.
Great to be diving in.
Today we are jumping headfirst into, well, a massive, really complex topic. Mass incarceration in the United States.
It really is. It's a system that's just exploded over the last few decades, and figuring out why is so crucial.
Yeah, it touches everything, right? Communities, families, state budgets, the whole idea of justice.
Absolutely.
And our mission today is to guide you through one of the most, well, talked about books on this subject recently, Locked In, The True Causes of Mass Incarceration and How to Achieve Real Reform by John Pfaff.
Right.
We've taken Pfaff's book, plus some really insightful reviews and responses to his work, and we're going to try and pull out the key facts, the surprising arguments, and the main insights.
The goal is really to help you get a handle on this important debate quickly.
Exactly. Think of this as your shortcut. Pfaff's book is, it's dense. Lots of academic data, statistical analysis.
It is. So we're aiming to translate that, show you the core of his argument, what he says we've maybe gotten wrong about mass incarceration.
Yeah. And what he believes is the actual kind of unexpected driver of the whole system's growth.
Yeah, it's very data-focused, less an emotional appeal, more a challenge to the conventional wisdom based on numbers.
Right. And we should be super clear up front, this topic, it touches on politically sensitive stuff. Crime, punishment.
Definitely.
So we're just reporting on the ideas and evidence presented only in the source materials we looked at. We're not taking sides here.
Nope. Just laying out what the material says, the different arguments being made so you can understand the debate.
Consider us your guides through the data and
The common narrative, the one often pushed by reformers, usually goes something like this. Our prisons are packed, just overflowing with low-level, non-violent offenders.
Especially people caught with drugs.
Exactly. Particularly simple drug possession.
Mm-hmm.
And the story says that super long sentences are the main reason the numbers are so high.
Okay.
Maybe they also point fingers at, private prisons making profits or the massive cost of the whole system crowding out other needs.
Right. So low-level drug guys, crazy long sentences, maybe private prisons pulling strings, and it costs a fortune. That's the gist.
That's the picture many of us have. But then Pfaff comes along, digs into the data, and basically says, hold on a second, that story, it's largely a myth, or at least it's way too simple and misses the real picture.
So he's challenging that whole narrative.
Directly. And this is where he starts throwing down the data points to back it up. Like the idea that prisons are full of low-level drug offenders.
Yeah.
He says the numbers just don't support that when you look closely.
Okay, what do the numbers in the sources actually show then?
Well, the material suggests that the majority of people in state prisons, which hold the bulk of the incarcerated population, are actually in for violent crimes. Something like 54%.
54% for violent crime.
Yeah, compare that to only about 15% for drug offenses.
Wow, okay. That's a really different picture than the standard story paints. 54 versus 15.
Huge difference.
Yeah.
And Pfaff also points out that even within that 15% convicted on drug charges, many might have actually committed violent acts but ended up pleading down to a drug offense, or that was just the charge that stuck.
Okay.
So his analysis suggests that even if we, say, decriminalized all drugs tomorrow, it would only lead to a relatively modest drop in the total prison population.
So not the silver bullet, some people think?
Not according to Pfaff's data. It wouldn't solve the core mass incarceration issue.
And it's interesting, one of the reviewers, Scheidegger, who seems pretty critical of Pfaff overall in the sources, actually agrees strongly on this point.
He does. Scheidegger calls that specific idea, that prisons are full of low-level drug offenders, a myth, and says Pfaff debunks it convincingly.
So, on that point at least, the data seems pretty clear to those looking at it.
It seems that way. Then Pfaff moves on to the second pillar of the standard story. The idea that increasingly long sentences are the main reason the prison population ballooned.
Right. That seems intuitive, though. Sentences have gotten longer for many crimes, haven't they?
They have, in many cases.
Yeah.
But Pfaff looks at it slightly differently. He focuses on the overall growth of the system, the total number of people inside.
Okay.
And he introduces this idea of looking at the flow of people, like how many are coming in versus how many are going out, not just how long they stay once they're there.
Like a bathtub analogy. The standard story focuses on the drain being slow.
Exactly. The drain is clogged, people stay longer. Pfaff says, yeah, but what about the tap? How fast is water pouring in?
Okay, the admission rate.
Right. He cites research suggesting that while the number of people entering prison shot way up and exceeded releases in the early 90s, driving that initial surge, that trend actually leveled out. The admission rate became, quote, fairly constant by the 2000s, even though sentencing laws were still changing.
Wait, so admissions sort of plateaued even while sentences were maybe still getting longer for some crimes?
That's his point. It complicates the idea that sentence length alone is the primary driver of the continued high numbers after that initial surge. He argues the admission rate became a more dominant factor later on.
That definitely goes against the standard narrative.
It does,
Hmm.
although Scheidegger jumps in here with a critique. He argues Pfaff focuses too much on really long sentences, like decades-long ones.
Okay.
Scheidegger says, even single-digit sentences for violent felonies add up and are a huge part of the population, and maybe those aren't excessively long in his view. So there's nuance, even in challenging that point.
Got it. So, less about drugs, maybe less simply about long sentences than about admissions. What about private prisons? They get a lot of blame in the standard story.
Pfaff tackles that too. He basically argues their influence is overhyped.
How so?
Well, according to the sources, private prisons hold only about 8% of the total incarcerated population in the U.S.
Only 8%. That feels surprisingly small compared to the attention they get.
It is, and again, Scheidegger strongly agrees with Pfaff on this. He calls the idea that private prisons are a primary cause not remotely plausible, given they hold such a small fraction.
Hmm.
Scheidegger actually points out that the public prison system is vastly larger. And think about this. The sources mention around $30 billion spent annually just on wages for public correctional officers.
$30 billion on public salaries versus
Maybe $400 million in estimated profits for private prisons. Scheidegger argues that $30 billion creates a much bigger built-in financial incentive within the public system to maintain the status quo.
That's a really important point. The public system has its own massive financial inertia. Okay, and the last piece of the standard story Pfaff challenges. The cost. The idea that prisons cost so much, they're bankrupting states and taking money from schools and healthcare.
Yeah, Pfaff pushes back on that too. He actually says, quote, "We don't really spend that much on corrections."
Really? How much does he say?
The sources cite his figure as maybe around 3% of total state budgets, on average.
3%. That seems low compared to how it's often portrayed.
It does. And Scheidegger agrees the number is factually correct, though he acknowledges it's a controversial point for some reformers.
Why controversial?
Well, Scheidegger notes the political angle.
Hmm.
Arguing corrections aren't that expensive might appeal to fiscally conservative voters who aren't swayed by soft-on-crime arguments, but are interested in saving money. It takes away one potential argument for reform based purely on cost savings.
Okay, so Pfaff systematically takes apart the standard story. It's not mainly low-level drug offenders. It's not just about sentence length driving continued growth. Private prisons are a small factor. And the cost, while significant, maybe isn't the budget buster it's made out to be.
That's a good summary. He uses data to argue that the narrative many people accept is fundamentally flawed or incomplete. Scheidegger's review even calls it a thoroughly documented demolition of those myths.
Okay, wow. So if the standard story is wrong, what is driving mass incarceration, according to Pfaff? What's his new narrative?
Right, this is the absolute core of Pfaff's book, and it points in a really different direction. He argues that the primary driver, the one most often ignored, is the power and the decisions of prosecutors.
Prosecutors. Not the judges, not the legislators passing the laws, but the local district attorneys.
That's his central claim. He says their charging decisions, day in and day out, are the main engine.
What's the evidence for that? That seems like a big claim.
The key piece of data he presents is this. Even while crime rates, and often arrest rates, were actually falling during the 1990s and 2000s, the number of felony cases filed by state prosecutors was significantly rising.
Wait, run that by me again. Crime is going down, arrests may be flatter down, but prosecutors are filing more felony charges. How does that work?
It feels totally counterintuitive.
Right,
And that's Pfaff's whole point. He argues this rising rate of filing felony charges, more than shifts in crime or even sentence lengths alone during that period, is what kept pumping people into the system and kept the numbers high.
So it's about the decision to charge someone with a felony in the first place.
Exactly. He describes prosecutors as having immense, often unchecked power in the system.
What kind of power are we talking about?
Pfaff says they often have a huge menu of potential charges, many different and overlapping criminal charges they can bring for a single incident. This gives them enormous leverage in plea negotiations. Plus, they're often politically powerful figures locally. Their offices tend to be better funded than public defender offices nationwide, and there's often very little transparency or real oversight into how they make their charging decisions.
And how does this power affect what actually happens to defendants?
Well, Pfaff points to a pretty staggering statistic cited in the sources. Something like 95% of felony cases that prosecutors file end in a guilty plea, not a trial.
95% plead guilty.
Yeah. And the review by Loseley highlights Pfaff's argument here. This immense power, combined with the threat of much harsher sentences if you risk going to trial and lose, can essentially coerce defendants into taking a plea deal.
Even if they might be innocent.
Loseley notes that's the concern Pfaff raises. It potentially undermines the constitutional right to a jury trial and could lead to wrongful convictions, because the critical decisions are happening behind closed doors in plea negotiations, driven by the prosecutor's leverage.
Okay, so Pfaff builds a strong case based on that filing data and plea bargain rates that prosecutors hold the keys to the kingdom, so to speak. How do the reviewers react to this new narrative? Does it hold up?
It's definitely debated.
Yeah.
Loseley's review finds Pfaff makes a strong case about prosecutor power being excessive and influential.
So Loseley buys the argument.
Largely, yes. But Loseley criticizes what they call Pfaff's either-or thinking. They argue that just because prosecutors are powerful doesn't mean sentencing reform isn't also important.
Ah, so it's not one or the other.
Right. Loseley suggests we need to address both prosecutor power, maybe with plea bargaining guidelines and sentencing laws. Both are part of the problem.
Okay, that makes sense. What about Scheidegger? He seemed critical before.
Much more critical of the prosecutor argument. Scheidegger calls Pfaff's evidence here thinly supported.
Thinly supported. Why?
He questions the specific data Pfaff uses to claim that prosecutors' charging decisions significantly limit judges' sentencing discretion nationwide. He thinks that link isn't proven broadly enough. Scheidegger also takes issue with how Pfaff frames prosecutor decisions. Pfaff sometimes describes prosecutors seeking more prison time for repeat offenders as simply being harsher.
And Scheidegger disagrees with that framing.
Strongly. He argues that distinguishing between a first-time offender and someone with a long criminal history isn't being harsher, it's just doing the job correctly. It's appropriate justice to consider prior record, in his view.
So one sees it as potentially excessive power being used. The other sees it as prosecutors appropriately exercising judgment based on criminal history.
Exactly. It shows a fundamental disagreement, not just on the data, but on the interpretation of why prosecutors act the way they do. Is it about justice, political calculation, something else?
Okay, so Pfaff's big central argument about prosecutors is definitely provocative and shifts the focus, but it's also clearly a major point of contention among experts.
Absolutely. It's where a lot of the debate sparked by the book seems to center.
It's clear that identifying the cause is complicated enough, but actually changing this massive system seems even harder. What do the sources say about the political realities, the roadblocks that make reform so difficult?
Oh yeah, this is a huge part of the discussion in Pfaff's book and the reviews. The politics are just baked into the system.
Like what?
Well, a major factor Pfaff highlights goes back to those prosecutors. Most state prosecutors, the ones with all that charging power, are elected locally, usually at the county level.
Right, so they have to answer to voters in their county.
Exactly. And Pfaff looks at the election results for these DA races and calls the record bleak.
Bleak. Why?
He points out that incumbents are very often unopposed or they get reelected easily. He interprets this as a lack of real democratic accountability, suggesting voters aren't really engaged or don't have meaningful choices in these crucial elections.
Okay, but how does Scheidegger see that same election data? I bet he disagrees.
You bet right. Scheidegger has a completely opposite take. He argues that incumbents winning easily isn't bleak at all, it shows voter satisfaction.
Ah, so if they keep getting reelected, it means the voters like what they're doing.
That's Scheidegger's view. He says this is exactly how democracy is supposed to work. People are choosing prosecutors who reflect their community's values on crime and punishment.
Wow, that's a fundamental clash in how they view democracy itself. Pfaff sees a problem, Scheidegger sees it working as intended.
Precisely. And because Pfaff sees elected prosecutors as part of the problem, he floats the idea of maybe appointing judges and prosecutors like the federal system does.
To insulate them from voter pressure.
Yeah, to make decisions based on perhaps data or guidelines rather than fear of election backlash. But Scheidegger slams this as an explicitly anti-democratic proposal. He argues against taking that power away from the people.
Okay, another huge political dynamic
But if someone gets sentenced to prison, it's the state that pays for that prison bed, not the county.
Ah, okay. So the county prosecutor makes the call, but the state picks up the tab for the long-term cost.
That's the moral hazard. Pfaff argues this creates a perverse incentive. For the local prosecutor and the county budget, sending someone to state prison is actually cheaper than dealing with them locally, maybe through jail time or community programs which the county would have to pay for.
So harsher for the prosecutor is cheaper, as Pfaff puts it.
That's his argument.
Yeah.
It creates a financial incentive at the local level to push people into the state system, regardless of whether it's the most effective or just outcome.
That seems like a powerful political incentive. How does Scheidegger respond to that?
Scheidegger pushes back really hard here. He basically says, so what? He argues that decisions about justice and punishment shouldn't be driven by cost concerns. He poses this kind of stark question. Do we really want prosecutors telling victims they can only ask for a short sentence because the county can't afford a longer one in state prison? He sees separating cost from the justice decision as a feature, not a bug.
Again, a really deep ideological difference surfacing there. What about voters themselves? Pfaff talks about defects in how the public approaches crime.
Yeah, he uses this term, low information, high salience voters.
Meaning?
Meaning voters might not know the complexities of the justice system, low information, but they react very strongly to rare, highly publicized, scary crimes, high salience.
Okay.
And he argues these voters tend to punish politicians much more severely for false negatives, like letting someone out who then commits a terrible crime, than for false positives, like keeping someone locked up for longer than necessary, even if they weren't really a danger.
And the classic example he uses for this is the Willie Horton case from the '88 election, right?
He does. Pfaff brings up the well-known story. A black man convicted of murder who committed a brutal rape while on a weekend furlough program in Massachusetts became the face of a negative campaign ad against Michael Dukakis, the governor at the time. Pfaff presents it as a prime example of a rare outlier case being used to scare voters and paint a candidate as soft on crime.
But Scheidegger takes major issue with Pfaff's use of that specific example.
Absolutely. Scheidegger calls Pfaff's account an atrocious misuse of the case and says it's factually inaccurate in key ways.
Like what?
Scheidegger points out things Pfaff omits, like Horton being ineligible for parole, and that Dukakis had actually vetoed attempts to tighten the furlough rules before Horton committed the crime. He argues the ad wasn't just a smear based on a rare event, but a valid campaign challenge to what he calls an astonishingly ill-considered policy.
So Scheidegger sees it as legitimate criticism, not just fear-mongering.
Yes, and he criticizes Pfaff for, in his view, repeating a stock story without fact-checking, to basically pathologize voters who prioritize public safety.
And Scheidegger even flips the script, suggesting that maybe the low-information, high-salience label could apply just as well to reformers voters who believe the standard story myths that Pfaff himself debunks.
It's a sharp back and forth, showing how politically charged even interpreting historical events can be in this debate.
Definitely. Okay, beyond voters and prosecutors, do the sources mention other political forces resisting reform, maybe from within the system itself?
Yes, both Pfaff and Scheidegger point to this. It's not just about private profit. There are huge public sector interests involved.
Like correctional officers' unions.
Exactly. Scheidegger brings up that $30 billion annual payroll for public correctional officers again. He argues that gives the unions representing them a very strong incentive to lobby against reforms that could lead to closing prisons or reducing staff. Fewer prisoners means fewer jobs.
That makes sense. And Pfaff adds another layer to that.
Yeah, Pfaff notes that prisons are often built in rural areas, and in many of those communities, the state prison is a major, sometimes the major employer. So the local politicians representing those districts have a very direct political incentive to keep the prison full, to protect those jobs and their local economy, regardless of broader criminal justice goals.
And this connects to a really specific, kind of wonky but powerful political incentive they both mention, the prison gerrymander.
This is fascinating and kind of hidden. In 42 states, the sources say, when they draw legislative district lines, they count incarcerated people as residents of the district where the prison is located.
Even though the prisoners can't vote there and usually come from totally different parts of the state?
Exactly. Prisoners are often disproportionately people of color from urban areas, which tend to vote Democratic.
Okay.
Prisons, as Pfaff noted, are often in rural areas, which tend to vote Republican. So you count these non-voting, mostly urban Democratic-leaning individuals as part of the population of the rural Republican-leaning district.
What does that do politically?
It artificially inflates the population count, and thus the political representation and power of those rural districts and the legislators who represent them. It effectively transfers political power from urban areas to rural areas.
And gives those rural legislators a direct reason to oppose reforms that would shrink the prison population.
Absolutely. Fewer prisoners would literally mean a smaller population count for their district, potentially weakening their political clout or even leading to their district being redrawn or eliminated. It's a built-in structural incentive against incarceration.
Wow. So the political landscape is just this tangled web. You've got election pressures on prosecutors, the weird financial incentives of the moral hazard, voter psychology, union power, local economic dependence on prisons, and even the way district lines are drawn.
It paints a picture where powerful forces seem structurally aligned against significantly shrinking the prison population, making policy change incredibly difficult.
Okay, so given that incredibly complex and challenging political landscape, what kind of actual solutions does a Pfaff propose in Locked In, and how are his ideas received based on these sources?
Well, Pfaff offers several proposals, and yes, some are pretty controversial, especially because they push back against that standard reform focus.
Like what?
A core argument he makes, flowing directly from his data showing most prisoners are in for violent crimes, is that you simply cannot make a major dent in mass incarceration without changing how we punish violent offenders.
That's the opposite of focusing on nonviolent drug offenses, which seems like the easier political path.
Exactly. Pfaff acknowledges this, calling violent crime the third rail of criminal justice reform, politically toxic to touch.
Yeah.
But he argues it's unavoidable if you're serious about reducing numbers.
And what does he suggest doing about violent offenders? Just shorter sentences?
He goes further. He questions whether we actually need to incarcerate violent criminals for as long as we do, even for goals like incapacitation or deterrence. And then he makes a really provocative claim. He suggests that, under certain conditions, less punishment for violent crimes could potentially even make society safer in the long run.
Whoa, wait. Less punishment for violent crime could make us safer. That sounds counterintuitive, to say the least. How does Scheidegger react to that?
Predictably, Scheidegger strongly disagrees. He calls that assertion off-target and says Pfaff provides no real evidence for it.
Okay.
Scheidegger argues Pfaff fails to show current sentences aren't needed for incapacitation, deterrence, or just plain justice. And he points to economic studies, even by researchers Pfaff cites elsewhere, like Stephen Levitt suggesting that sentence severity does actually have a significant deterrent effect on crime.
So Pfaff's most fundamental proposal tackling violent crime sentences runs into major pushback on grounds of safety, justice, and evidence.
It's definitely the most contentious part of his argument, according to these reviews.
What about more specific policy ideas? Does he offer concrete steps?
He does. For instance, he suggests expanding the use of parole even for those convicted of violent felonies.
But isn't releasing violent offenders early politically radioactive, thinking back to that Willie Horton example?
Exactly. Pfaff recognizes that political risk. So to try and manage it, he proposes using quantitative risk assessment tools.
Algorithms, like parole by algorithm.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
Using statistical tools to try and predict the likelihood of someone reoffending, the idea being that basing decisions on objective data might help insulate parole boards or politicians from the intense backlash if someone they release does commit another crime.
Using an algorithm as a political shield, basically.
That seems to be the idea presented. Scheidegger, however, views this very cynically. He interprets it as Pfaff essentially saying, let's accept the risk that innocent people might be victimized, but make sure the officials who made the decision are protected from blame.
Yeah.
Scheidegger also points to the political reality. He notes that recent major reforms that did pass, like Prop 57 in California or the Federal First Step Act, were explicitly marketed by excluding most violent offenders. He argues this shows that expanding parole for violent offenders is pretty much a political non-starter right now, algorithm or no algorithm.
So the risk assessment idea faces criticism both on ethical grounds, potentially enabling harm while shielding officials, and on political grounds just not being viable. What else does Pfaff suggest, especially regarding prosecutors, since that's his main focus?
Right, this is where he puts his biggest set of proposals, aiming to somehow regulate or counterbalance prosecutor power.
Okay, like what?
One major idea is significantly boosting funding for public defenders. Pfaff sees them as potential regulators. If defense attorneys had more resources, they could push back harder against prosecutors.
Makes sense in theory. Would it actually lead to fewer people going to prison, though?
Scheidegger is skeptical. He says there's really no clear data showing that simply giving public defenders more money significantly cuts imprisonment rates.
Why not?
Partly because, as Pfaff himself notes, the vast majority of cases end in plea bargains anyway, often before a robust defense can even be mounted. Scheidegger agrees better defense funding is good in principle for fairness, but he doubts it's a lever that will dramatically reduce overall incarceration numbers.
Okay, so more money for defenders might not be the key. What other ways to regulate prosecutors does Pfaff float?
He throws out a few ideas. Maybe federal grant programs to incentivize prosecutors to focus only on the most serious offenses, though Scheidegger thinks most already do that and finds the idea unsupported.
Mm-hmm.
Or gathering much more data on how prosecutors use their discretion. Scheidegger notes this is incredibly hard to do meaningfully, could be dangerous if data is misused, and might just lead to officials finding ways to game the metrics.
Right.
Or maybe statewide sentencing or charging guidelines controlled by the state attorney general. Scheidegger argues this undermines local control and accountability to local voters. Or even electing prosecutors from smaller districts instead of county-wide. Scheidegger warns this could actually increase risks, like corruption or capture by special interests, pointing to problems in places like Baltimore.
So lots of ideas, but each seems to have significant practical or political challenges, according to the critiques.
It seems that way. Pfaff also suggests that activists should mobilize voters to elect less tough-on-crime prosecutors.
The progressive prosecutor movement, basically.
Yeah. But Scheidegger adds a crucial point. He says, Pfaff omits the massive role played by large out-of-state donors, particularly George Soros.
Ah, the argument that it's not purely grassroots.
Exactly. Scheidegger highlights the millions poured into local DA races by Soros-funded groups to elect specific reform-minded candidates. He questions whether this is really just local voters demanding change, or if it's influenced by billionaire agendas, and notes this movement has faced some recent political headwinds and recalls.
That adds another layer of complexity to the idea of electing different prosecutors. One last proposal mentioned is using sentencing commissions. What's the idea there?
Pfaff suggests taking sentencing guideline decisions away from legislatures, who might react emotionally to headlines, and giving that power to independent commissions.
Why? To make sentencing more rational.
According to Scheidegger's reading of Pfaff, the goal is explicitly political, to insulate sentencing from democratic pressure and make it easier to achieve scaling back punishments through what Pfaff apparently calls a less risky, meaning less democratic path.
So, deliberately bypassing elected officials to lower sentences.
That's how Scheidegger interprets Pfaff's candor, and he criticizes it strongly as anti-democratic. He argues Pfaff defines success for these commissions only by whether they reduce prison populations, ignoring whether the sentences are actually fair or just. Scheidegger sees it as delegating core legislative power to unaccountable appointees, something even conservative legal figures like Justice Scalia questioned.
It really seems like Pfaff's proposed solutions, especially the ones involving violent crime or trying to work around direct democracy, are just as debated and controversial as his diagnosis of the problem.
Definitely. The sources show a deep divide runs through the entire discussion, from causes to solutions, often reflecting fundamentally different views on justice, risk, and the role of democratic accountability.
Okay, so if Pfaff's main arguments and solutions are sparking so much debate and pushback, are there other potential paths forward? Scheidegger's review apparently mentions a road not taken by Pfaff.
Yeah, Scheidegger suggests an alternative focus that he feels Pfaff doesn't fully explore. Instead of focusing primarily on changing punishment, what if we focus more on reducing crime itself?
Reducing crime as a way to reduce incarceration.
Exactly. Scheidegger argues that if crime rates go down, then naturally, fewer people will be arrested, charged, and incarcerated over time. He points to a potentially puzzling trend Pfaff himself notes in the book. The number of violent crime prisoners actually fell quite a bit between 2011 and 2013, even though most reforms were supposedly focused on nonviolent offenders.
Interesting.
Scheidegger suggests this might indicate that falling crime rates were having an effect, leading to fewer violent offenders entering the system. If that's true, then investing in proven crime reduction strategies could be a way to lower incarceration without making controversial changes to how we punish violent crime.
And what kind of crime reduction strategies does he suggest?
Things like investing in more effective law enforcement, perhaps more police officers, or specific data-driven policing strategies like CompStat or community policing initiatives. He cites a dramatic crime drop in New York City as a potential example of effective policing, leading to less crime and, eventually, less incarceration.
So, shifting the focus way upstream to preventing crime in the first place, rather than tinkering with the back end of the system.
That's the core idea. It's a fundamentally different approach.
Hmm.
Scheidegger also brings up something even broader, the role of culture.
Culture, how does that fit in?
He cites research suggesting that the underlying culture, the shared beliefs, values, norms within communities, is potentially just as important, if not more so, than law enforcement in determining crime rates.
Meaning.
Meaning a culture that strongly emphasizes respect for the law, respect for others' rights, personal responsibility. That kind of cultural environment could inherently lead to less crime and therefore less need for punishment and incarceration.
That's a much bigger, more societal perspective.
It is, and Scheidegger makes a specific critique of Pfaff here. He notes that Pfaff does call for cultural change, but mostly in terms of changing public attitudes toward punishing crime. Scheidegger argues Pfaff overlooks the need for cultural change regarding committing crime in the first place.
So, crime prevention through policing and maybe even broader cultural shifts. These are presented as alternative or complementary paths that Pfaff's analysis perhaps underemphasizes.
That's the argument Scheidegger puts forward in his review, yeah.
Let's loop back to something Pfaff argued in his own article responding to reviews, this idea that mass incarceration isn't just a policy failure, but a political or ideological one.
Right. He emphasizes that it's really hard to fix policies when the underlying political incentives and ideologies support the status quo. Like that moral hazard we talked about, it persists because it works politically for local actors, even if it leads to bad outcomes overall.
So policy tweaks alone might not be enough if the political winds are blowing the other way.
That's his concern. He thinks policy fixes can get subverted or watered down if there isn't a deeper shift in the political landscape or the underlying thinking.
Which brings us right back to that tension between big top-down state-level reforms versus maybe slower bottom-up local changes.
Exactly. And the sources use California and New York City as prime examples of these two different approaches.
California's realignment was the big top-down one, right?
Yeah, huge policy shifts in 2011, basically forced on the state by federal courts because of prison overcrowding. They had to shift responsibility for tens of thousands of lower-level felons from state prisons down to the county-level county jails and probation.
What was the immediate result?
Pfaff notes it had a big, quick impact. California's state prison population dropped by around 30,000 people relatively fast, and it accounted for about half the entire national decline in prison populations during those first few years.
So a major drop from a top-down mandate, but there were problems.
Big problems, highlighted by both Pfaff and Scheidegger. First, California fought the court order tooth and nail. Second, almost no other states followed their lead. It wasn't widely replicated. Third, county jail populations swelled, offsetting about a third of the drop in the state prisons. And fourth, counties immediately started lobbying the state for money to build more jails and got billions in subsidies. Pfaff sees this as local actors kind of subverting the original intent.
And realignment mostly excluded violent offenders, right?
Yes, which Pfaff argues limited its potential impact on the overall scale of incarceration, since violent offenders are the majority.
Okay, so top-down. Quick impact, but also resistance, local subversion, unintended consequences, and maybe limited scope. How does that compare to the bottom-up example?
Pfaff points to New York City. NYC saw this long, steady decline in its jail population over 30% between 2000 and 2016.
And what drove that, according to Pfaff?
He argues it wasn't mainly big state laws changing. New York's notoriously harsh Rockefeller drug laws were largely still in place then. Instead, he credits cumulative, gradual changes happening at the local level. Shifts in prosecutors' charging decisions and changes in police practices.
So, local actors changing their behavior over time.
Exactly. Pfaff contrasts this with California's abrupt shock. He suggests that these slower bottom-up changes, while maybe less dramatic initially, might lead to a more fundamental and sustainable transformation because they reflect changes in local practices and maybe local attitudes.
And he sees the progressive prosecutor movement as evidence of this bottom-up potential.
Yes, he argues it shows that changing hearts and minds, or at least mobilizing voters who already favor reform, is possible at the county level, particularly in urban areas where the costs of crime and punishment are felt most directly. He thinks this might be happening more effectively than trying to force top-down change.
So, Pfaff's conclusion, at least in his response article, seems to be that maybe other analysts underestimate these political factors like the moral hazard, and they miss the significance of these successful bottom up county level reforms.
Yeah, he basically says the easy top-down path tried in California hasn't spread, while the harder bottom-up path of electing progressive prosecutors has seen success in many places. He ends up arguing for a both-and approach, recognizing we likely need action at both the state and local levels, each with its own challenges.
Okay, so wrapping this all up, this deep dive into John Pfaff's Locked In, looking at it through the data and these different reviews, it leaves us with a lot to chew on.
It really does. We've seen how Pfaff uses some pretty rigorous academic analysis to really question, even dismantle, core parts of that standard story.
Right.
Most people hear about mass incarceration,
Right, showing it's way more complicated than just blaming low level drug offenders and long sentences.
and then how he builds his own new narrative based on data, pointing to the often overlooked power of prosecutors and their charging decisions as a key driver of the system's growth over recent decades.
We've also navigated that incredibly tangled political landscape. Elected prosecutors, the moral hazard, voter psychology, public sector unions, prison jobs, even the way we draw district lines, all these forces that seem to make real reforms so incredibly difficult.
Yeah, the political obstacles are immense.
And we touched on the different ideas for solutions, from Pfaff's really controversial focus on violent offenders and trying to regulate prosecutors, to those alternative paths mentioned in the reviews, like maybe focusing on crime reduction itself, or even thinking about the role of culture.
It's just abundantly clear from all these sources that there's no single easy fix here. Experts who agree on some of the facts can still profoundly disagree on the main causes, the best way forward, and even the fundamental principles of justice involved.
Absolutely. Fauss analysis definitely provides a ton of academic detail and factual grounding to push that conversation forward, even if it sparks disagreement.
For sure.
And here's maybe a final thought, something to mull over that builds on what we discussed. If, as Scheidegger suggests, reducing crime rates is a viable path to lower incarceration without necessarily changing how we punish violent crime,
Huh.
and if, as he also argues, culture, our shared values and norms, plays a really significant role in how much crime happens in the first place, what does that imply about where our focus should be? Does it suggest that maybe lasting change requires looking beyond just policies and political incentives towards deeper shifts in our communities and our society itself?
That definitely pushes the question beyond just the mechanics of the justice system.
It does. Something to think about. Thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive.